The crisp autumn evening in Arlington, Virginia, painted the sky in deep shades of purple and orange as Officer Michael Brooks settled into his usual patrol route. The peaceful suburban streets were bathed in the warm glow of streetlights, and the occasional rustle of fallen leaves added to the tranquility of the night. Brooks had been on the force for 8 years, and nights like these usually meant routine traffic stops and quiet neighborhood checks. Cruising down Cedar Lane, one of the more affluent areas in Arlington, Brooks noticed a sleek black Mercedes-Benz S-Class approaching the intersection ahead. The car caught his attention not just because of its luxury status, but because something seemed off about how it moved through the stop sign, a subtle rolling motion instead of a complete stop. Brooks straightened in his seat, years of training kicking in as he flipped on his patrol car's lights. The Mercedes pulled over smoothly, indicating an experienced driver who knew the drill. As he radioed in the stop to dispatch, Brooks noticed the car's slightly tinted windows and District of Columbia plates, not unusual for the area, but enough to raise his internal alert level slightly. Following standard procedure, Brooks approached the vehicle from the driver's side, his right hand resting casually near his holstered weapon. The autumn wind carried the distant sound of children playing in their yards and dogs barking, typical sounds of early evening in this upscale neighborhood. As he drew closer, he could see the driver was a well-dressed black man, probably in his 40s, sitting perfectly still with both hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good evening, sir," Brooks said, his flashlight beam sweeping across the car's immaculate interior. "License and registration, please." His voice carried the authoritative tone he perfected over years of traffic stops. The driver's response was calm and professional, speaking with the measured tone of someone used to handling high-pressure situations. "Good evening, officer. My documents are in the glove compartment. Would you like me to retrieve them?" Something about the man's composed demeanor and the way he carried himself made Brooks pause. Most people showed at least a hint of nervousness during traffic stops, but this driver exhibited an unusual level of confidence. The car's interior smelled of expensive leather and supple cologne, and a perfectly pressed suit jacket hung in the back seat. "Yes, go ahead," Brooks replied, watching intently as the driver slowly reached for the glove compartment. The movement was deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if the driver was very aware of how his actions might be perceived. As the man handed over his license and registration, Brooks noticed his hands were steady, no trembling, no hesitation. The documents were organized and readily available, another detail that stood out to the experienced officer. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Brooks asked, studying the driver's reaction in the beam of his flashlight. "I apologize if I didn't come to a complete stop at the intersection," the driver responded. "I'm running slightly behind for an important meeting." Brooks's suspicions began to grow. In his experience, people who drove expensive cars in this neighborhood typically lived here and knew the area well. This driver was clearly from out of town, and despite his professional appearance, something didn't sit right with the officer. "Where are you headed at this hour?" Brooks questioned, his tone shifting slightly. The driver's calm demeanor remained unchanged as he replied, "I have an urgent meeting to attend. I'm already running behind schedule." The vague response only served to heighten Brooks's suspicions. In his mind, pieces of an entirely different puzzle began to form, one shaped by years of dealing with sophisticated criminals who used legitimate-seeming covers to mask their activities. As the evening traffic hummed in the background and porch lights began flickering on in nearby homes, neither man realized that this routine traffic stop was about to escalate into something that would shake the foundations of local law enforcement and spark a national conversation about prejudice, power, and justice. Little did Officer Brooks know that his next decision would not only change the course of his career, but would also serve as a wake-up call for police departments across the country. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would become a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving and assumptions can have far-reaching consequences. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Brooks studied the driver's license in his hand. The name on the ID belonged to a Mr. Wilson, and everything about it seemed legitimate, too legitimate, according to Brooks's suspicious mind. His flashlight beam swept across the car's interior once again, searching for anything out of place. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Brooks commanded, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't there before. The request caught Mr. Wilson off guard, but his response remained measured and professional. "May I ask why that's necessary, officer?" Mr. Wilson's voice was steady, though a hint of concern had crept in. He understood the delicate nature of traffic stops and remained conscious of every movement he made. "Sir, I said step out of the vehicle," Brooks repeated, his hand now resting more firmly on his holster. The streetlights cast long shadows across the scene as nearby residents began to take notice of the encounter from their windows. Mr. Wilson took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling slowly. He'd been in challenging situations before, but this one felt different. With deliberate movements, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. As he stepped out, his expensive Italian leather shoes crunching on fallen leaves, Mr. Wilson stood tall, his tailored suit and commanding presence at odds with Officer Brooks's preconceptions. He was clearly someone of importance, yet here he was, being treated like a common suspect. "Place your hands on the hood of the car," Brooks ordered, his training taking over as his suspicions continued to mount. The cool metal of the Mercedes felt smooth under Mr. Wilson's palms as he complied with the officer's directions. "Officer, I need to inform you that you're making a serious mistake," Mr. Wilson said calmly, maintaining his composure despite the humiliating position. "I'm running late for a critical meeting that concerns national security." Brooks scoffed at this statement, having heard every excuse in the book during his years on the force. "Sure, and I'm the president's personal chauffeur. We've had reports of high-end vehicle thefts in this area, and your story isn't adding up." The autumn wind picked up, rustling through nearby trees as Brooks began his pat-down. The officer's movements were mechanical, practiced, but his mind was racing with assumptions. The expensive car, the driver's unusual calmness, the out-of-area plates, in his mind, it all pointed to something suspicious. "Sir, do you have any weapons or anything that could harm me?" Brooks asked, continuing his search. Mr. Wilson's response was clear and direct. "No, officer. But I do have credentials that you need to see. They're in my inside jacket pocket." Brooks ignored the statement about credentials, instead focusing on a small bulge in the suit jacket. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. "That's exactly what I'm trying to tell you about, officer. Those are my credentials. If you'd allow me to show you—" "Keep your hands where they are," Brooks interrupted, his voice growing more authoritative. "You can explain everything down at the station." Nearby, curious neighbors had begun to gather on their porches, smartphones discreetly recording the scene unfolding before them. The blue and red patrol lights painted their faces in alternating colors as they watched the well-dressed black man being treated like a criminal. Mr. Wilson maintained his dignity even as Brooks pulled his hands behind his back to apply the handcuffs. The cold metal clicked into place, each snap echoing in the quiet street like a judgment. But there was something in Mr. Wilson's eyes, not fear or anger, but a knowing look that suggested this situation was about to take an unexpected turn. "Officer Brooks," Mr. Wilson said, his voice now carrying a weight that made the officer pause momentarily. "In about 2 minutes, you're going to regret not checking those credentials. What's about to happen will change both our evenings significantly." Brooks dismissed the statement as another attempt to avoid arrest, but something in Mr. Wilson's tone made him feel uneasy. The certainty in the man's voice didn't match the typical behavior of someone being arrested. As Brooks began reading the Miranda rights, the distant sound of approaching vehicles caught his attention. The rumble grew louder, different from the usual suburban traffic. Mr. Wilson stood calmly in handcuffs, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Last chance, officer," Mr. Wilson said quietly. "Those credentials would save us both a lot of trouble." But Brooks was committed to his course of action now. He'd made his decision based on what he thought he knew, what he thought he saw. As he reached for the patrol car's back door, he had no idea that the next few moments would completely upend everything he believed about this traffic stop. The rumbling grew louder, and headlights appeared around the corner. Whatever was coming would change not just this evening, but the entire trajectory of both men's lives. The gathered neighbors held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The quiet suburban street suddenly erupted with the sound of screeching tires as 2 black SUVs came around the corner at high speed. Their tinted windows and government plates immediately caught Officer Brooks's attention, the vehicles expertly boxed in his patrol car, their powerful engines idling with a low rumble that seemed to shake the ground. The neighborhood residents watching from their porches stood frozen, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. The blue and red lights from Brooks's patrol car continued to paint the scene in alternating colors, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. "What did you do?" Brooks demanded, turning to Mr. Wilson, who remained remarkably composed despite the handcuffs. "I didn't do anything," Mr. Wilson replied calmly. "But they know exactly where I am at all times. I tried to tell you this wasn't a simple traffic stop." Before Brooks could respond, the doors of both SUVs swung open in perfect synchronization. 4 individuals stepped out, each moving with the practiced precision that comes only from years of specialized training. Their suits were similar to Mr. Wilson's, and their bearing spoke of authority and purpose. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel gray hair and an air of unmistakable authority, approached them directly. Her badge was already out, the metal catching the streetlight as she held it up. "Release him. Immediately." Brooks found himself stammering, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. "Ma'am, I'm in the middle of an arrest here. This is a police matter." This stopped being a police matter the moment you pulled him over, she cut him off, her voice sharp enough to slice through steel. "The man you've handcuffed is a senior CIA operative en route to a Level 1 priority briefing at Langley. By detaining him, you've just interfered with a matter of national security." The color drained from Brooks's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his keys to remove the handcuffs. The clicking sound of their release seemed to echo down the quiet street, each click feeling like another nail in the coffin of his career. As the handcuffs came off, Mr. Wilson rolled his shoulders gently, adjusting his suit jacket with the dignity of someone who had faced far worse situations. He reached into his inner pocket and finally pulled out the credentials he'd been trying to show earlier, a special badge and ID that made Officer Brooks's eyes widen in recognition. "Level 1 security clearance," Mr. Wilson explained, though his tone held no mockery or triumph. "I've spent the last 15 years protecting this country, Officer Brooks, including the people in this neighborhood you thought I was here to rob." The other agents had formed a protective circle around Mr. Wilson, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings out of habit. One of them spoke quietly into a wrist-mounted communication device, likely updating someone about the situation's resolution. The lead agent wasn't finished with Officer Brooks. "Your supervisor will be receiving a full report about this incident. Every second of this unnecessary detention has compromised operational security. Do you understand the gravity of what's happened here?" Brooks's throat felt dry as he managed to respond, "Yes, ma'am." The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical force. He could feel the stares of the neighbors who had witnessed everything, their phones still recording this unexpected turn of events. Mr. Wilson adjusted his tie and stepped toward one of the SUVs, but paused to address Brooks one final time. "Officer, I hope this serves as a lesson. The badge you wear comes with great responsibility. The power it gives you should be used to protect and serve everyone equally, not to reinforce prejudices." The lead agent handed Brooks a card with official government contact information. "Expect a call tomorrow morning. This incident will require a full review." Her words carried the weight of consequences yet to come. As Mr. Wilson settled into one of the SUVs, the other agents quickly returned to their vehicles. Within moments, they had pulled away from the scene, their taillights disappearing around the corner as swiftly as they had arrived. Brooks stood alone in the street, his patrol car's lights still flashing uselessly. The gathering of neighbors began to disperse, their murmured conversations carrying mixed tones of disbelief and judgment. Some shook their heads, while others pulled out their phones, likely sharing what they'd witnessed on social media. The autumn wind picked up again, scattering leaves across the empty street. Officer Brooks slowly walked back to his patrol car, each step heavy with the realization that his next shift would be very different. His world had just been turned upside down in less than 15 minutes, all because he'd let his preconceptions guide his actions instead of following proper procedure. As he sat in his car, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in fully. Tomorrow would bring investigations, questions, and consequences. But perhaps most importantly, it would bring the need for serious self-reflection about the true meaning of serving and protecting all citizens equally. The next morning arrived with the harsh reality of consequences. Officer Brooks sat in the police chief's office, his uniform feeling unusually tight around his neck as he faced the department leadership. The chief's expression was a mixture of disappointment and concern as he held up his tablet, showing a viral video of last night's incident. 3 million views already, the chief said, his voice heavy. Every major news outlet has picked it up. Do you understand what this means for our department? The morning sun streaming through the office windows seemed to spotlight Brooks in his chair, making him feel even more exposed. On the chief's desk lay a thick folder, Brooks's service record for the past 8 years. Next to it was a more concerning document, a formal letter from the CIA demanding a full investigation into the incident. The agency's seal at the top of the page seemed to stare at Brooks accusingly. I was just following protocol, Brooks tried to explain, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held the previous night. The neighborhood had reported suspicious vehicles. The chief raised his hand, cutting him off. Let's review the dash cam footage together. He pressed play on his computer, and Brooks was forced to watch his actions from an outside perspective. Each moment of the recording felt like a punch to the gut. The footage clearly showed Mr. Wilson's cooperation, his repeated attempts to explain his situation, and Brooks's escalating response despite no apparent threat. Seeing it played back made Brooks sink lower in his chair, his earlier justifications crumbling with each passing second. According to the video, the chief continued, he tried to show you his credentials 3 times. You ignored him 3 times. Then you put a high-ranking intelligence officer in handcuffs while he was heading to a national security briefing. The chief's words hung in the air like heavy smoke. A knock on the door interrupted them. The department's public relations officer entered, her face tense. Sir, the press is gathering outside. They're requesting a statement about last night's incident. Social media is exploding with hashtags about police reform, and several civil rights organizations have already issued statements. The chief rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation. That's not all, he added, turning back to Brooks. The CIA's deputy director called personally this morning. Do you know what he told me? That briefing Mr. Wilson was heading to. It was about a potential threat to our national infrastructure. Your actions delayed critical intelligence from reaching key decision-makers. Brooks felt the room spinning slightly. What had started as a routine traffic stop had snowballed into something that could affect national security. The realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation hit him full force. The public relations officer spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. We need to get ahead of this. The community is demanding answers, and they deserve them. The video clearly shows, well, it doesn't look good. The chief stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the growing media presence outside the station. Camera crews were setting up, and reporters were preparing for their live broadcasts. The morning sun glinted off their equipment, creating a dazzling display that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation inside. Officer Brooks, the chief said, turning back to face him, you're suspended pending a full investigation. We'll need your badge and gun. The words felt like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision. As Brooks slowly removed his badge, his fingers trembling slightly, the chief continued. The CIA has agreed to cooperate with our internal affairs investigation. They're sending over Mr. Wilson's service record, or at least the parts that aren't classified. Do you know what we learned? He's received 3 presidential commendations for his service to this country. The public relations officer's phone buzzed continuously with notifications. Sir, she interrupted, the mayor's office is calling. They want to know our plan for addressing the systemic issues this incident has highlighted. Brooks placed his badge and gun on the chief's desk, the metal making a final, decisive sound against the wood. The weight of their absence felt enormous, like a piece of his identity had been stripped away. I never meant for this to happen, Brooks said quietly, more to himself than anyone else in the room. The morning light caught his face, revealing the deep lines of worry that hadn't been there yesterday. The chief's expression softened slightly. I know you didn't, but intentions aren't enough anymore. This incident is going to change things around here, for all of us. He looked down at the growing stack of papers on his desk. The department will be conducting mandatory bias training for all officers. We're also reviewing our traffic stop procedures. As Brooks stood to leave, feeling the absence of his badge and gun, the chief added one final thought. This isn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. This is about trust, trust that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. We're supposed to protect and serve everyone equally. Yesterday, we failed at that mission. The walk through the police station felt endless. Brooks could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental. The weight of his actions pressed down on him with each step, and he knew that whatever happened next would define not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to wear the badge. 2 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest conference room was filled to capacity. The blinds were drawn against the bright afternoon sun, and a projector displayed statistics that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. The department's internal affairs investigation had uncovered patterns that could no longer be ignored. Officer Brooks sat in the back row, now in civilian clothes, watching as the deputy director of the CIA stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. This wasn't just another sensitivity training session, this was about fundamental change. What happened 2 weeks ago wasn't just about one officer or one traffic stop, the deputy director began, her voice carrying authority earned through decades of service. It was about assumptions that could have compromised national security. But more importantly, it exposed biases that compromise our fundamental values as public servants. The presentation screen behind her switched to show Mr. Wilson's career highlights, or at least the unclassified portions. Multiple tours of duty, lives saved, threats neutralized, medals earned. The room absorbed this information in stunned silence, realizing just how wrong first impressions could be. The officer who pulled over our agent that night, she continued, glancing briefly at Brooks, made a series of assumptions based on appearance. Those assumptions nearly delayed critical intelligence from reaching decision-makers during a time-sensitive operation. The police chief stood up next, his face showing the strain of the past 2 weeks. We've completed our initial review of traffic stops in our department over the past 5 years. The data shows disturbing patterns that we cannot ignore. The graphs on the screen told a clear story of disproportionate stops and searches. In the middle of the room, several community leaders who had been invited to participate nodded gravely. They'd been talking about these issues for years, but now there was undeniable proof. The deputy director continued, Mr. Wilson has agreed to work with your department on a new training program. Despite what happened, he believes this can be a turning point for positive change. She paused, letting that sink in. A man who was handcuffed without cause is now willing to help the very department that humiliated him. That's the kind of integrity we should all aspire to. Brooks felt the weight of every word. He'd spent the past 2 weeks replaying that night over and over in his mind, recognizing moments where he could have, should have, made different choices. The presentation shifted to body camera footage from the incident, now being used as a training tool. The room watched in silence as the events unfolded on screen. Seeing it again, everything looked different. Mr. Wilson's calm demeanor, his repeated attempts to explain, the unnecessary escalation, it all seemed so clear now. We've identified several critical points where this situation could have been handled differently, the police chief explained. These will form the basis of our new training protocols. He clicked to the next slide, showing a comprehensive reform plan. The changes were significant: mandatory bias training every 6 months, community engagement programs, revised traffic stop procedures, and a new oversight committee that included community members. The department was being rebuilt from the ground up. A community leader stood up to speak next. This incident went viral because it was caught on camera, she said, her voice firm but compassionate. But how many similar situations happen every day without cameras present? This isn't about one night or one officer, it's about changing an entire system. Brooks listened intently as she described experiences from her community, stories of fear, distrust, and the daily anxiety of wondering if a routine traffic stop might go wrong. Each word hit home, making him understand the deeper impact of what had happened. The deputy director returned to the podium with a final announcement. Moving forward, the CIA will be partnering with police departments nationwide to implement similar training programs. What happened here in Arlington will serve as both a warning and a catalyst for change across the country. As the presentation concluded, Brooks approached the deputy director. His voice was humble but determined. "I'd like to help with the training program," he said. "My experience, what I did wrong, maybe it can help other officers make better choices." She studied him for a moment before responding. "Your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and work to prevent others from repeating them, that's exactly the kind of change we need to see." The afternoon sun finally broke through the blinds, filling the room with natural light. It felt symbolic somehow, as if illuminating a new path forward. The road ahead would be challenging, but at least now they were facing in the right direction. Officers began filing out of the conference room, many deep in thought or engaged in serious discussions about what they'd learned. This wasn't just another mandatory training session. This was the beginning of real change, sparked by one traffic stop that went wrong in all the right ways. 3 months after the incident, the Arlington Police Academy's main auditorium was packed with a diverse crowd of police officers, community members, and media representatives. The late morning sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating the stage where Mr. Wilson stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Change," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "doesn't happen overnight. It happens one decision at a time, one interaction at a time, one person at a time." The audience sat in rapt attention, many taking notes, others nodding in agreement. In the front row, Officer Brooks sat in his uniform, recently reinstated after completing intensive training and counseling. The past 3 months had transformed him in ways he never expected. The badge on his chest felt different now, not just a symbol of authority, but a reminder of responsibility. Mr. Wilson continued, sharing real-world scenarios from his extensive experience. "I've operated in some of the most dangerous places in the world," he explained. "But sometimes, the most challenging moments weren't facing armed threats. They were facing prejudice from the very people sworn to protect and serve." The presentation screen behind him showed statistics, but not just numbers, real stories, real impacts, real changes being made. The Arlington Police Department had become a model for other departments across the country, their new training program attracting attention nationwide. "When Officer Brooks pulled me over that night," Mr. Wilson said, glancing at the reinstated officer, "he made decisions based on assumptions. Today, he's helping us teach others how to make better choices." He gestured for Brooks to join him on stage. Brooks stood, his steps measured and purposeful. The walk to the stage felt like walking through his own transformation. 3 months ago, he couldn't have imagined standing here, sharing his story as a lesson in change. "I've spent 16 years protecting this country," Mr. Wilson continued as Brooks reached the podium. "But that night in my own country, I was treated like a threat because of how I looked. Officer Brooks and I could have let that moment divide us. Instead, we're using it to bring people together." Brooks took his turn at the microphone, his voice steady but humbled. "That night changed everything for me," he admitted to the crowd. "I thought I was doing my job, following procedure. But I wasn't seeing the whole picture. I wasn't seeing the person." The audience listened intently as Brooks described the changes in his approach to policing. He talked about the community outreach programs he now led, the relationships he was building, and the trust he was working to restore. A young officer raised her hand during the question and answer session. "How do you balance safety concerns with avoiding bias?" she asked, voicing what many were thinking. Mr. Wilson stepped forward to answer. "Good policing isn't about ignoring potential threats," he explained. "It's about assessing situations based on actions, not assumptions. It's about treating everyone with respect while staying alert and professional." The chief of police, sitting in the front row, stood to address the audience. "Since implementing our new training program, we've seen a 40% reduction in complaint filings. Our community satisfaction ratings have improved significantly. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real change is in the daily interactions between officers and citizens." As the presentation continued, local community leaders shared their perspectives. They talked about noticing positive changes in police interactions, about feeling more heard and respected. One elderly resident spoke about how officers now regularly attended community events, building relationships instead of just enforcing laws. Mr. Wilson shared videos from body cameras showing positive examples of the new approach in action, officers taking time to listen, to understand, to serve their community with respect and dignity. Each example reinforced the message that effective policing and equal treatment weren't mutually exclusive. The incident that brought us here today could have ended very differently, Mr. Wilson concluded. Instead of headlines about conflict, we're creating headlines about change. Instead of viral videos about what went wrong, we're making videos about what's going right. Brooks stood beside him, a living example of transformation. Every traffic stop, every interaction is a chance to either build trust or break it, he added. We're choosing to build it, one encounter at a time. The presentation ended with a standing ovation, but this wasn't just applause for a good speech. It was recognition of real change happening in real time, of people choosing to learn from mistakes instead of defending them, of a community coming together to create something better. As the audience began to file out, many stayed behind to share their own stories or ask questions. The conversation was continuing, expanding, reaching more people with each passing day. What had started as a tense traffic stop had become a catalyst for lasting change. 6 months after the traffic stop that changed everything, the Arlington Police Department hosted an open house on a bright Saturday morning. The parking lot was filled with community members, food trucks, and activity booths where officers and residents chatted like old friends. Officer Brooks stood at his community outreach booth, now wearing a new badge on his uniform, Community Relations Coordinator. Children ran around playing with plastic police badges, while their parents engaged in honest conversations with officers about neighborhood concerns. Remember when those patrol cars used to drive by and everyone would get tense? An elderly resident said to Brooks, smiling as she watched kids high-fiving officers. Now my grandkids wave at them and they wave back. That's what real change looks like. Near the main entrance, a large screen displayed the department's new training videos, including footage from that fateful night 6 months ago. But now, instead of causing anger, it served as a powerful teaching tool. New recruits watched attentively as instructors pointed out key moments where different choices could have led to different outcomes. The deputy director from the CIA had returned for the event, this time accompanied by Mr. Wilson. They stood observing the scene, noting how different it felt from that tense night half a year ago. The same street that had witnessed the confrontation now hosted community members and officers sharing meals and stories. 6 months ago, I never thought I'd say this, Mr. Wilson admitted to the gathered crowd during his speech, but something good came from that night. We turned a moment of conflict into an opportunity for change. He gestured to the busy scene around them. This is what happens when we choose to learn from our mistakes instead of defending them. The police chief stepped up next, holding a thick binder. Our new training program has been adopted by 12 other departments across the country, he announced proudly. What happened here in Arlington is creating ripples of change nationwide. Brooks listened from his booth, remembering how different things had been just 6 months ago. His own transformation had become part of the department's success story. He now led weekly community engagement sessions, teaching other officers what he'd learned about looking beyond first impressions. A group of teenage boys approached his booth, one of them wearing a shirt with aspirations of becoming a police officer. Officer Brooks, the boy said, I saw your story online. It made me want to become a cop even more, to show that we can do things differently. The afternoon brought more surprises. Community members shared stories of positive interactions with police over the past 6 months. A local shop owner described how officers now regularly stopped by just to chat, building relationships instead of just responding to calls. The real measure of our success isn't in statistics, the police chief explained to a reporter. It's in moments like these, where our officers and community members interact naturally, without fear or suspicion. Mr. Wilson had been right about karma that night, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of punishment, the incident had brought transformation. Instead of division, it had created unity. Near the end of the day, Brooks and Mr. Wilson stood together, watching the successful event wind down. You know, Mr. Wilson said, that night could have ended our careers. Instead, it gave us both a new purpose. Brooks nodded, watching as the last few families gathered their children and headed home. I learned that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing laws, he replied. It's about serving people, all people, with respect and dignity. The sun began to set over Arlington, casting long shadows across the police station parking lot. The same street lights that had illuminated that tense traffic stop now shone down on empty food truck spaces and leftover celebration decorations. As cleanup crews began their work, the police chief gathered his officers for a final word. "Remember," he said, "every day is a chance to build on what we've learned. Every interaction is an opportunity to prove that change is possible." The local news crews packed up their equipment, having captured footage of something rare and valuable, a story about police and community coming together, about mistakes leading to growth, about real change happening in real time. 6 months had passed since that traffic stop, but its impact continued to grow. What started as a moment of confrontation had become a movement of transformation, spreading from one department to another, one community to another, one person to another. As the last cars pulled away from the parking lot, the message was clear. Sometimes the best way to handle karma isn't to wait for it to hit, it's to transform it into something positive that benefits everyone. That night 6 months ago hadn't just changed 2 men's lives. It had changed an entire community's future.